there are people today, despite the traditional view in philosophy, the boo hooray theory regarding statements, that would argue that many statements that we would consider opinion questions are nonetheless true, absolutely true. So we could still argue over that, of course. But when we go and we look at Aristotle's Ethics, here we go. This is another big book that you could spend a whole semester just reading this book and analyzing it and all the interesting things. The same as the metaphysics, which, just reading through it, you find so many things. I caught how he's talking about time in the metaphysics, and he argues that, well, time is kind of like numbers. When you think about numbers, you got 1, 2, it's, and that's one of the problems for Plato and his theory is that ideas, are supposed to be clear. We might not be able to understand them from a life perspective because our body corrupts us, so our soul is not able to clearly see things. Right now we're looking through a glass darkly, famously, he says, and apparently, the glass that they made was kind of rudimentary at the time, so when you look at glass or a mirror, you weren't actually seeing yourself very clearly, so we're looking through a glass darkly. But eventually, once our souls are released from the body, we'll be able to understand the ideas perfectly. But for that theory to work, there has to be a theory, an idea of number. And the trouble with that is just like with colors. When we were talking about the color wheel, all the different colors you could have, that means that we'd actually need a color for every possible type of, an idea for every possible type of color. We would need an idea for every single number. And it's an infinite number of numbers. So you would end up not really being able to have a clear idea of what numbers are. So that's another example of what's wrong with it, right? And the very first thing that Aristotle points out, when you think of the idea of the good from Plato's perspective, there's only one ideal good. You imagine the sun, like in the allegory of the cave, for example, the sun is that's where all light comes from, etc. That's where all good comes from, and so there's only one ideal good, and everything else, in some sense, participates in that goodness. So that's how Plato tries to explain that in his model, right? Which admittedly is fictitious, it's made up, it's an imagination, going crazy, right? Aristotle comes along and points out that you can't have that kind of good because every art and every inquiry and every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good. And these are all different. They don't all have the same kind of characteristic that makes them good. That's not why we call them good. It's, good pizza has nothing to do with good narration or good navigation or good dentistry. Or, right, if you think of all the different kinds of arts and activities that we get involved with, you're just not able to really come up with something that makes all of the things that we call good fit into one particular category. They're all so different. In fact, when we get later into the Romantic period, Hegel, my favorite, points out that when you have conflicts, up until Hegel maybe, people thought that when you have a conflict between the good and the evil. We still have a lot of people today that speak that way. And it feels right. in a lot of situations, doesn't it? It feels right. But what Hegel points out is when you analyze cultures and you see how many different cultures there are and how there are conflicts between different cultures, that many of those conflicts are between two different variations of the good. There's actually good things on both sides that are in conflict, right? Makes it very confusing. I remember when President Trump referred to the people in Charlottesville, I think it was, that they had the torch parade and everything. And remember there was one girl that was run over by there was like a riot almost, and conflict between people. And President Trump said, there are good people on both sides. A lot of people were furious with him because, of course, they didn't like anybody on the other side, right? But strictly speaking, Trump was right about that. There has to be. And of course, it depends on which side you're on. So if you're going to stand apart, in a sense, and look at both sides and try to judge them and understand what's going on, you can't take sides. If you feel absolutely these people are right and these people are wrong, you can't be an adequate referee, in a sense. It might not be even possible in some cases. So today we like to, I think, argue that there are good sides in conflict. It might be really difficult to figure them out. It looked almost like a question, but it wasn't. I remember Christopher Hitchens. Anybody know Christopher Hitchens? He died in 2021. But he was one of the four so-called atheists of the apocalypse, or whatever they called themselves, goofy things. There was Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, who's on my list of philosophers, Richard Dawkins, who's on my list of philosophers, and Sam Harris, who's on my list of philosophers. So Christopher Hitchens was the only one I didn't put on that list. Because strictly speaking, he's tried to be a philosopher. He was a philosopher, but he wasn't that good a philosopher, I think. But he's the one that wrote the book, God is Not Great. God is Not Great. That was his. All four of those authors tried to argue against faith. That was right after September 9/11, September 11, right? After the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, and the other one ended up in the field in Pennsylvania, right? We just passed that anniversary, right? 20 years ago, right? Is that right? Am I adding right? My math skills are terrible.
24.
24? Okay. Yeah, I was thinking there's more numbers in there than just 20. Thanks. We just talked about it, and they had a ceremony in New York and so on. But Christopher Hitchens, in his book, and the other three too, all in their various books. And Daniel Dennett's book, I thought, was really the most serious to argue. All argue, and in fact, the one person critiqued the title and said it's got exactly one word too many. He just needed to say God is not. He didn't need to put great on there. So they're atheists, and they basically argue that God doesn't exist. There is no such thing. And by the way, as far as he's concerned, the people that believe in God should be embarrassed. That was their goal, to completely embarrass all these folks. Because what they were trying to do is prevent that sort of thing from happening again, to stop their being fundamentalists. And not just Islamic fundamentalists. If you look at an American project, the fundamentalism, by Martin Marty. Martin Marty was the one who directed it. This was after the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States government said, aha, well, now who will be our next enemy? And a committee of others, a bunch of them, all came to conclude that fundamentalists will be our next enemy of all sorts. This was before Waco, for example. So basically, if you go, by the way, if you check these books out of the library, they're there, but just be aware that they're really big books, each of them. I made the mistake of checking 3 out once at a time, and I wasn't able to get it all the way to my office before my arms gave out. So don't check out too much at once, unless your arms might be much stronger than mine. However, and they're fascinating, and they've been incredibly accurate. But what's the difference between a fundamentalist and a pravoslavец, or a good believer? Are there people that believe in religion that are...
Talk about radically different idea, new idea.
Huh.
Fundamentalists, in my opinion, seem to be more concerned with tradition than questioning their tradition. It's like I don't know.
Well, this gets into what I'm thinking of is Aristotle is going to tell us that in order to raise a good child, you want to teach the child good habits, good morals, good ethical Ethica means character. So if you want a child that has a good character, and I'm sure Aristotle is only talking about males, male-oriented at the time. You need a good society. You need a good community. It takes a community to raise a good child. This is an Aristotelian idea. Because you need a good family. But imagine living in South Sudan right now. Almost any place that I could think of in South Sudan, a family is not going to be a coherent whole. They're probably already been attacked multiple times. It's just horrible. There's no way that I can imagine living in South Sudan. The people there are in a far worse disaster than most of the disasters that we currently see in the news most of the time. And so raising a good child in that situation would seem impossible. They're already traumatized. Same thing with the kids in Gaza. They've been, their homes have been blown up. They've been moved around. They might already be inculcated in a view that other individuals should be destroyed, which I don't know if that's really the best way to raise a child, to raise the child to feel like certain individuals ought to be destroyed, just because of who they are, for example. But for Aristotle, you have to have a good community as well as a good family, because the good family isn't going to be possible without a good community, and the good community in the larger sense needs to be in a good polis. For Aristotle, that would be the largest community that he would be thinking about, is the city-state, the polis, right? And so you need a good city. So when you're talking about ethics, you're talking about politics. So the folks that have been pointing out that Charlie Kirk was political, even though theoretically he wasn't a politician, he was talking about a meta-narrative